So if we want to talk about this more, we want to honor the time. We have guests who have time limits and have to leave soon, so we want to make sure to use their time. I'd be happy to talk about this more later in the meeting, but I just wanted to start the meeting by saying thank you for your time and for your consideration.
Maybe just a quick question. I'm sorry about walking late. It's the catch up with you later, but your sense is the conversations you're having outside this room?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, for the record, I'll put whatever keep on the record and say we haven't had a conversation outside this room.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, let's launch our
All right.
agenda. Thank you.
So let's, we were gonna start with the Portland Harbor Superfund. And we have Annie Von Berg, who's the city's lead for the Superfund project, and Maddie Novak from EPA. Just really wanted to get a grounding in where things are with the Superfund, the issues related to cleanup and costs and liability. We've referred to it hang like a cloud over the industrial area, the waterfront, and are a barrier to reinvestment and reuse of some of the vacant development capacity that is out there along the river. And so one of the assumptions that gets made through the EOA is like, well, how much redevelopment, reinvestment can we expect in the next 20 years in the harbor? And part of that is just understanding where the Superfund process is and what's coming next, and when we think it will sort of reach a point of resolution or more clarity that businesses feel more comfortable to reinvest, because we haven't seen a lot of new development in that Superfund area because of the liability and the cost concern. So I'm going to turn things over to Annie and Maddie to really help us understand where we're at with the whole process.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for your time today. I think a lot of folks in this room are very familiar and intimately involved in Portland Harbor and the process. So the intent today is to give you a high-level overview of the status of where we're at. Maddie's here from EPA, which thank you so much for your time, to give EPA's perspective and status on what's going on at a global scale with Portland Harbor, because this is a federal cleanup site. And then I'll provide a little information once she gets through just kind of where the city is at and how the city is involved here. As many of you know, the city of Portland plays many roles when it comes to the cleanup site. And so we'll talk about a little bit of where the city is at in the places where it plays a role. And then we'll talk about next steps. But please, at any point, feel free to jump in for clarifying components. We do have some designated time at the end here for Q&A. So over to Maddie to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right, looks like it's working. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I was asked to provide a status update of the progress on the Portland Harbor Superfund site remedial design and circulation remedial action. And I know a lot of folks here have a fair amount of background on the Superfund site, but I'll go through a little bit of the background, not spend a lot of time on it so that we can spend more time on status and answering any questions that you have. But if at any time something is not clear, you want to get more information, just stop me and I can answer questions along the way as well. I'm a remedial project manager on 106, like the Superfund site, and also in a temporary position as the team lead right now. And I'll just a few words about the folks that are involved, the entities that are engaged in this process. EPA is the lead regulator for the in-water cleanup. That in-water cleanup goes up to the riverbank in many cases. And the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is our support agency, and then they are the lead agency in the uplands, and also for controlling sources, any ongoing sources to the in-water portion. We have the potentially responsible parties. There are over 150 of those parties. Some of them have signed up to do the design work right now and are performing that work. We have multiple community groups, some of which are represented here. One, Riverkeeper, the Portland Harbor Community Advisory Group, and the Portland Harbor Community Coalition. We have lots of agencies involved, federal and state, local. 6 tribes are involved, providing input on a technical basis. And so there's a lot going on. There's a lot of folks involved, very engaged. So I like this map because it shows the neighborhoods in Portland, where the Portland Harbor spans. It starts essentially at the north end of downtown. It goes to about a mile north of the Sobeys Island, and then just also ends at the mouth of the Multnomah Channel there. About 10 miles of river. And this shows where we are in the design process. We're coming up on the end. We're getting there. The Superfund process starts with identifying the problem, evaluating what risks there are to human health and the environment, collecting a lot of data, assessing that, identifying how it should be cleaned up. And then there's a record of decision that was issued in 2017. It's a decision document. It says how generally in concept, the Portland Harbor should be cleaned up. And now we're in design, taking that concept to implementation. And it's a complex process. So we have 10 miles of river. We have 64 chemicals of concern that we're trying to address. As I said, 150 plus potentially responsible parties. Lots of different waterfront uses. And so getting from that, oh, we should do some dredging and capping, to no, we're going to put a dredge bucket here and we're going to take this much out and we're going to take it there. And, how are we going to cap it and what amendments are we using? A lot of data, a lot of work goes into that. And then we'll segue into remedial action. I'll give you a better sense of schedules here in a minute. But this map shows that there are about 17 or 18, depending on how you count them, different project areas that are being designed, sort of, general concept. There are different discrete designs going at all of these different bubbled areas led by different entities. And this shows the status of the designs at these locations. So along the left side, those are the different bubbled areas. Those are the names of the different bubbled areas. And along the top are the different design elements that are required to get to 100% design. So we can segue into remedial action. And you can see there are some areas that started before other areas. They're further along. There are different complexities in the different areas. So they are not all coming along at the same exact time. This is okay. We expect the remedial action to take about 13 years. So we're not going to be doing everything at once anyway. We can have some designs complete first, start remedial action, and go as people are ready with their designs, and also to the extent it makes technical sense to sequence things that way. So we are making quite a bit of progress. I know we haven't seen, we've seen a lot of sampling out in the river. We don't have, actual construction happening yet, but it is our one of our main priorities, EPA's priorities, to transition to remedial action without delay. There's a lot of work going on to get those designs refined, and we are targeting 2026 to initiate the remedial action work. There's some work that would take place before there are actually, heavy equipment in the river. The people have to develop work plans, stage things, do contracting, things like that aren't visible. But definitely looking to initiate that work in 2026. And the way we get process-wise from the design work we're doing now to remedial action is to have a consent decree where people sign up, and they sign up to perform the remedy, actually do the remedial construction, and then other entities settle out. So they pay a share of it. And that's entered into by potentially responsible parties, the Department of Justice. Yes, the Department of Justice gets involved in those negotiations. This is, since we're talking about land use, I thought it would be a good idea to show, generally speaking, where at the time of the ROD in 2017, when this was all still concept, we expected the actual construction to take place. Of course, these areas are being refined, but we're not seeing a huge amount of change, some expansion, a little bit, shrinking in some areas, but generally speaking, this is where we expect the construction to take place. So in terms of land use, and I'm wrapping up here. So if I'm not hitting, the information that you need, you'll have plenty of time to ask questions. So the land that EPA is involved in terms of the Superfund site in this case is in water, the shore, and the riverbanks. And so in terms of our influence on development and land use, it's relatively limited, depending on the designs and the decisions made. There will be waste left in place in some places. And so there will need to be some controls around that waste. So we wouldn't want that to become exposed in the future and cause unacceptable risk. So to the extent there's waste left in the environment, and say there's a cap built over it, there would be controls around the use of that area. But we do consider land use in the in the decision documents, in the investigations, and the consideration of the remedial actions, and the record of decision. Current and future land use is considered in the selected remedy. Right now, during design, the performing parties are engaging with landowners that are potentially impacted by designs. They're looking, getting survey results and trying to assess future, current and future land use. We know there to be, dredge areas, or areas that need to be maintained and dredged for future use. So that's accounted for. And, thinking about all of the docks and wharves and, in water infrastructure that's in place, that's something that's considered as well. And I do want to highlight, we do welcome input from the community at each of the design areas. There is a point in each of those project areas that was represented in the bubbles that I showed in the figure, in the process where there's enough information known about what anticipated remedy will look like, that we think it's a good idea to check in with the community and see what feedback they have for us on that. So, for example, River Mile of an East at the far south end, upstream end, upriver end of the Portland Harbor, they have gone through this process where they have provided a design document, it can be reviewed, and they present where, generally where the actual action is going to take place and what kind of action. So is it dredging? Is it some other kind of cap or in situ remedy? So the community can understand what this would look like in the future and have an opportunity to comment on that. We expect that to be happening pretty soon at Willamette Cove, I think, and also Swan Island Basin this year. I just wanted to put this diagram in here. sometimes it's useful to see where the EPA purview starts and ends, where the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality purview starts and ends, and then there's this confusing area in the middle of the river, right, where we can, EPA and DEQ can either oversee that action or we can both oversee it depending on the circumstance. It's very specific to each river, right? So, and that's sort of the intro on you know, the background and where we are. I'm open for questions.
Are there any questions at this point? Otherwise, we'll have Annie continue with the city's role in all of this.
Yeah,
Yeah, Bob.
I'm just trying to formulate it. I guess sometimes I hear Superfund as a reason to move forward, and I hear Superfund as a reason to delay. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, because I feel like it's actually been used as an obstruction to progress on the river for the entire time I've been doing this work since the harbor's been listed.
Yeah.
And at the same time, to be very candid, I think sometimes the forces that use it as an excuse not to do anything else also delay Superfund as well. It's kind of how long can we put off everything and keep the status quo and complain about it as well. And so I'm just curious about that. I mean, how do you really see the EOA and Superfund and NERDA intersecting? And you know, I mean, just to telegraph my own perspective, I mean, I think it's a both and. I think all these things have to move forward together, and they're somewhat synchronistic, and they get at what the bigger community cares about in terms of holistic. We want the river cleaned up. We want a river plan. We want access. We want restoration. We want jobs. And all these things ultimately kind of have to sync up, but they have to kind of sync up in real time. It can't be sequenced in a way that delays us for decades. But
Yeah, agree. I think the Superfund liability can make things uncertain, right? And I think that is what gives folks pause. We're in a point in the process now where we're able to provide more and more certainty. We're getting designs done, and people can have a better prediction about what what it will look like in the coming couple of years, really, really soon. And I think it necessarily needs to be an iterative process, because as we inch forward in our designs, we have one slice of the holistic picture that everybody runs, right? And so as we make progress on our slice of work, we can provide the information, present it, get input, and as work groups like this move forward on the elements they're trying to work forward on. So I'm encouraged that we're making some progress, and we're going to be able to provide folks with some certainty about what things will look like in the future. I feel like with the community involvement that I've seen, we are doing that engagement, not just we EPA, but all of us are doing the work to connect all the pieces and parts, for a better holistic outcome. I'll come talk to whatever group you want, so that can be continued.
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Cassie.
Hey, Annie, I was gonna ask you a question actually. The city, state, and port had started with a contract with Work Systems Inc. to look at job forecasting opportunities for the Willamette Cove in-water section of the Portland Harbor Superfund site, but it was supposed to also kind of think about like how can we apply that site-wide. And it's been delayed because the design of the Willamette Cove, because they said they needed more information from the completion of the Willamette Cove remedial design, which it sounds like is almost near completion now. So I'm curious if you are continuing to follow through with that forecast and contract for phase 2, and when you anticipate that to be completed and to be able to be shared with like all the folks here as well as Portland Harbor community stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And for those that may not be familiar with that report, so this is something that the city and state and port in a combination of different ways has been working on for several years. And it's been frankly a big challenge. And the goal of this report and this analysis is kind of to understand what jobs may be generated as a result of the cleanup work itself. And if there are policies, interventions, ways that we as public agencies can partner to try to capitalize on that and really hold that within our region. That's the goal. We've run into a couple of situations. Originally, we tried with Oregon Solutions, for example, and the National Policy Consensus Center. And what we've been running into is just not enough data to quite get us to conclusions that kind of help us into that next policy development stage. So with Willamette Cove, we thought we could use that as a pilot project as we started incrementally getting through the design process, have that feed into an assessment that can kind of give us some real-time understanding of what we're looking at, and maybe possibly something we can scale up to understand what this might mean for the 10-mile stretch, not just that individual site. So Work Systems Inc. has been working really hard on it. They've experienced the same challenges that we've experienced with other consultants. So the data is just really hard to pull together. I believe, Cassie, I'll have to get back to you on the latest. I believe we have hit one of the milestones in terms of a first draft. That I think our teams are reviewing. I'll need to go back and make sure that that's the case. But we're hopeful that we're at a stage that we can start kind of thinking about those next steps and working through whether that's coming up with the next stage of drafting that or finalizing it. So I would be happy, and I can keep this group apprised of the progress with that. But that's something we're really looking forward to seeing the results of. I think it really starts to help us as a city and a public agency, seeing what we can do to help in that space.
Thank you. And just so folks have context, like that was one piece, but for, I guess, community and labor stakeholders that had been talking with all the public agencies for a couple of years. That was not kind of we didn't see that piece was dependent or necessary to move forward on thinking about how to secure career pathways for local and regional folks who want to have a part in cleaning up the river, but also like upland sites, and being able to do restoration for upland sites, and then have transferable skills for other career, job opportunities with the other major infrastructure projects that are going to be happening in the region and that kind of thing. So I know like that's not the only thing we're looking at in this group, but I thought it was relevant anyway to be thinking about, because that's there's a number of stakeholders not in this space that care about the long-term potential for, really securing high quality, good paid jobs for folks who need those jobs the most.
It looks like Rose, you had a question?
I do. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I have a couple comments and real questions. But I think it's important when I hear, especially when I hear EPA talk about Portland Harbor, sometimes it feels like things are going really well. We're in this process, we're getting started, we're seeing actions, activity move forward. And that is correct. Things are moving forward, but they're certainly not moving forward in the timelines that were expected. And when it comes to this group, I think it's important to understand that we're trying to understand the various sort of land use, and especially the need for industrial land. And having Superfund a Superfund site, in the city of Portland, over a 10-mile stretch, it's not just the river, it includes upland areas. And I think often there's this lack of clarity between on the Superfund boundaries. We often hear EPA talking and they are, focused on in-water. But when the site was listed, the site includes not just the in-water portion. The NPL listing includes the upland portions, upland boundaries. And so whatever work is going on inland or in water, there's also an upland component to that. And I don't think we have a lot of clarity on sort of that upland boundary and how that impacts potential available industrial land. In addition, we often talk about timelines, and I've made a statement before. We've blown through a lot of timelines, especially timelines that EPA itself came out to the community, came out to the tribes, came out to Yakama Nation specifically, and talked about the timeline for getting a decision made. The record of decision was signed in 2017, and we heard very clearly through from EPA at all the various public meetings, and when EPA came and talked to Yakama Nation, that we would get to cleanup levels in 30 years. It was going to be a 30-year cleanup. And so our expectation was that we would reach cleanup levels by 2047. But that is not the case. In fact, when you look at the current schedule, and I think, what was presented here was we're hoping to initiate work in 2026. It's a target. It's not a hard date. So we're already several years past almost 10 years, even if we're almost 10 years from when we signed the ROD, from when the ROD was signed. And then EPA is adding on an additional 30 years of M&R. So at the very, very best, we can expect meeting cleanup in 2069. But that's at the very best. So what we originally thought was going to be a cleanup of about 30 years is really resulting at 52 at the very best, but it's probably going to be much longer than that. So we have lack of clarity on boundaries. We have some timeline impacts that are significant. And also, I think there's other issues like no agreement on the vision or goal for habitat restoration or recovery. I probably should refer to it as habitat recovery within the in-water portion as well as the upland portion of the river. And just the other major impact, there's multiple issues here, but I'm thinking about what impacts this group's discussions and thinking about available industrial land, or at least areas where industry would be interested in coming to and locating and doing additional development. So the not source control, but upriver source control. All of those issues have an impact to the work that we're doing in sort of trying to understand what land is available for various uses, but most specifically industrial development. Thanks.
Thanks, Rose. Timothy, do you have a short question or comment?
I just had maybe a couple of quick comments. Again, Timothy Novak, I'm with the Bureau of Development Services. I'm a planner with Land Use Services. And so I'm the one who's applying the code and seeing what's happening on the ground. And just wanted to reiterate a couple of points that folks had. One is that the Superfund has been and continues to be used by some landowners to avoid doing greenway landscape plantings, arguing that, well, they're just going to get torn out when the Superfund comes. So they're in that sort of, is it DEQ or EPA riverbank area? And so just to put that out there, it's been quite frustrating. And so maybe you can quickly comment on whether that's a legitimate argument that they're making or if it's just sort of a way to get out of it. And then secondly, in regards to sort of the availability of industrial lands, I can say that the lack of upland cleaning and just using sort of the quick capping process is creating challenges. So right now there's a battery storage system site on North Time Oil Road that's in the process of going through Greenway review. And in order to make it work, and this relates to the floodplain stuff, you know, it's in the floodplain, so they have to lift it out of the floodplain. They have their balance cut fill requirements. And so they're creating some floodplain storage. Well, rather than utilizing a direct connection to the river that could be coupled with some habitat restoration projects, because the site is contaminated, that wasn't allowed. And so in the end, they're just building basically this giant pond on the site that's taking up a lot of what would otherwise be available for industrial uses to offset their fill requirements. And so we're actually losing industrial lands because we're not doing a suitable job on the upland cleanup. So those are my two comments. Thank you.
Just quickly, just looking at managing the time and want to give time for Annie.
So, I mean, I think you're hearing actually the same thing repeated in different ways here, as this is my comments as well, which is we are seeing Superfund used as a delay tactic. We're also concerned, as Rose said, about the habitat issues and the loss from different things, whether it's through the industrial land process or Superfund cleanup processes. Are we ultimately going to have an ecologically functional north reach of the river? And I think that's getting lost in every one of these conversations. Everything else is a higher priority. And meanwhile, the very limited chances we have to restore the North Reach, which is the pinch point in the whole 187-mile long Willamette River, and it's the most drained stretch of river in the entire region. All the work we do upriver for salmon gets undermined in the Portland Harbor as we make it harder and denude it further. So I'm just wondering how you can help us with that issue and where NOAA Fisheries is as well on that issue. Where NOAA Fisheries has been absent from this discussion for 10 years. And so where do they come into this picture to make sure that we're not losing that piece of the puzzle? And I guess that's the question is.
Yeah, I'm just looking to see, there've been a lot of questions in the last multiple minutes and just wondering how we should proceed.
Well, yeah, if you have some thoughts on those issues.
The most recent, sure. Yeah, in terms of that habitat aspect, I won't be able to comment much on the NOAA process. So there are two processes under CERCLA under which habitat enhancements will occur in the Portland, right? And so one of them, it is under NOAA's purview. And that is restoration associated with the harm previously done, you know, in the time that the amount of time that harm has occurred as a result of the hazardous substances in the environment. And so that's a restoration activity that's under that purview. And that's all I have on that one. But under EPA, the way it works is, you know, our charge is to address risks to human health in the environment associated with exposure to chemicals. And that is it. However, when remedial actions are constructed, there can be some, you know, primarily what folks try to do is to limit any adverse impacts associated with that construction, to address the unacceptable risks. However, if it's unavoidable, they can build and then also mitigate. So it's compensatory mitigation for the remedial construction that is being conducted to protect human health and the environment. So there are a couple of ways that compensatory mitigation can be handled. One is to purchase credits, and one is to build habitat on site. And that is the preference. We are not at a point where we know yet exactly, how these designs, where this will occur. This additional habitat to account for what was lost through the construction.
So I just wanted very quick, I think it's a quick question. Can you just say, I just want to know about the implications if we do capping in terms of what we're talking about here with industrial land and especially river dependent related. So from an EPA perspective, if capping is the solution, what does it mean for what can and can't be done in the river in terms of future expansion of existing wharves and facilities and that sort of thing? Just sort of at a basic level. I mean, can something be said, or is it sort of very dependent on the situation?
Everything's dependent on the situation, but I think, generally speaking, if there is waste left in place and a cap placed on top, it would impede use of that area, such as building a wharf through it. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but there will be institutional controls around knowing that waste is there, knowing the cap is there, and generally speaking, that there would be no construction that would penetrate the cap and release hazardous materials. But, as time goes on and, there are new uses of the river, there could be an avenue for, rebuilding aspects of the cap, dredging out portions. So it's not never, but it would absolutely have to address the issue of the hazardous substances and, as part of that development.
Annie, do you want to just run through what you had for us today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're over time, so I'll buzz through this really quick. I'll actually just skip ahead. So kind of building on top of what Beatty showed, and she showed this image as well. So of course, EPA is running the whole show, and there are a number of ways that the city participates and has a role in this cleanup. So as you all know, we're a regulator. We are unfortunately a potentially responsible party, or PRP, at the site. We're also a steward of natural resources here throughout this area too. So looking through multiple lenses as we participate in the Superfund. And also as it applies to this work, understanding that this is right squarely in the center of Portland and has a huge economic impact to the city and the state. And so also understanding the ramifications of the Superfund on the local economy as well. So here is a list of where the city of Portland is involved throughout these sites. So depending on how you count it, for about 18 to 20 individual sites, EPA has broken this up into for it to be more manageable. 8 of those sites, the city of Portland is a partial funder of that. And so we do track progress there and kind of follow along as those sites move forward. And then we're a performing party in a few other areas, River Mile 11, Willamette Cove, also partnering with the state of Oregon for an information management plan, something that also looks at how do we communicate and store information related to institutional controls. So helping EPA think through what the long-term kind of data collection, data sharing of this big site is. The hopes is that we can make this information more transparent and more timely for everyone kind of involved in tracking progress, not just to when we get up to cleanup, but really in the long term, both with once cleanup is finished and how long-term monitoring goes. So, and we also have fish advisories that we have now successfully passed over to EPA to work directly with Multnomah County on. That's also something that CD has played a role in, is just what the risk communication is. So folks know what their risks are. With that, I'll move over specifically, and this kind of shows where we're at relative to this larger timeline. The 2 InSight projects that the city is working on with a group of partners, both of them chosen for very specific reasons, but River Mile 11 East, anticipating that that's going to be one of the first sites that needs to move forward. It's at the very top of the boundary. So it's very important, and it has been for years, for us to participate, get that one early moving along, knowing it's one of the more complicated sites too. So really trying to work through some of those technical challenges. 30% design we hit this last winter, and we're now currently working on our estimates, time estimates for 100% design, hoping to really looking at EPA's timeline and wanting to reinforce these implementation expectations and targets. So with Willamette Cove, that also presents a lot of opportunities there as being one of the areas that has the most opportunity for environmental improvement and for public access. So really important there as a publicly owned site. We will be hitting 30% design here this spring, so really soon, and we're estimating to hit 100% in 2026. So again, really supporting and backing up EPA's timeline with this for implementation. Moving on. So as Nadine was talking about, we're really getting into this window of time that's really important in transitioning from remedy design to remedy implementation. So a couple of those components that are going to be critical in really understanding what this timeline looks like is completing these designs, getting to 100%. Also, what's going to be really important too is reaching a settlement with all of the parties involved. That will be key in actually being able to meet these timelines at play. And then kind of getting into some comments here specifically to Bob's point, avoiding delays. We're also at a very convenient point in the timeline where there are, we believe, two intentional delays happening. So doing what we can, which in a lot of situations isn't much, to avoid delays in moving forward. Just a quick overview settlement process. So this is the City of Portland has been involved in an out-of-court settlement process since the beginning. So I believe it's been about 8 or 9 years now. The intent of that process is to come up with a good faith offer to the EPA that will outline how much parties are going to pay and who's going to do the work. The work obligations will span for over 30 years here. So it will address a lot of the uncertainties in terms of short and long-term roles for the parties that will both be funding and performing the work. This is an extremely complex process, and so it's going to take time. And so we are kind of marching towards a deadline, though. We know that EPA expects the cleanup start in 2026. And so how do we resolve and get over what is a significant hurdle in terms of reaching a settlement between the parties? Again, our hope is that reaching this point in the process will address a lot of the uncertainty that we point to when we're looking at long-term land use in this area and under development in this area, that this will provide a level of information that will really help us transition and move forward.
I ask a real quick question on settlement?
Sure.
Does the city see itself as a prospective performing party on the remedial action?
We can't discuss that. And really, everything is on the table. And I'm not sure anybody that's in the process right now knows what they're going to do just yet. And this, I should say, it's not unique. All settlement and out-of-court settlement processes are confidential. So unfortunately, that is information we can't talk about. So any more questions on that piece? I'm going to switch over to the natural resources.
It looks like Rose, do you have a question?
I do, but I'll hold off until the presentation is done. So I'll take down my hand.
Okay.
Okay, great. And I'll buzz through this really quickly. Unfortunately, we were hoping to have a representative from the Natural Trustee Council here to talk about the NRD settlement process. I think it's come up a couple times in this space about what that looks like. So I have a fact sheet from the Trustee Council that I can distribute to this group. And I also have a fact sheet for the City of Portland. So I can speak to just the city's role in that settlement and then pass along any questions you have to the Trustee Council on the more global approach here. But overall, like has been mentioned before, the natural resources damages process is different than the cleanup process, and the settlement process is different from the cleanup component. This is to recover damages from losses to wildlife habitat, to resources that have tribal significance in the recreational usage of the river. So the city has been working on this since the very beginning, 2003, as supporting the process. These also really complex, resource-intensive process to do these assessments and evaluation. So the city has been kind of contributing as a supporting agency for that. Ultimately, the way that parties meet their obligation here is to pay the trustee council or be paid for restoration credits directly. And there's a kind of a network that has been set up with for restoration banks within the site now for settling parties to take advantage of. Now, there's a number of parties involved here, but there's a first wave of settlement, and you may have seen that in the paper recently, and a comment period just closed on that. The city of Portland was involved with that first wave of settlements. I believe if you calculate it, the first wave of settlements kind of totals about 11% of the total. So there's still a lot more to go on that front. But as you'll see on this screen, the trustee council came up with what the total damages for the entire site is. That's the ecological damages, the recreational, tribal damages, and they quantify those. The city's portion of that settlement total, and I can walk through that just really quick, was the 61 DSAs for the ecological restoration component of that. Almost 61,000 for the combination of recreational losses and the tribal services losses, and then almost 250,000 for the assessment, kind of the administration fees that go with that. So for a total of $4.8 million was the city of Portland's portion of that. There were, I think, a little over 20 parties. And I think it was around 33 million total. So the city was almost 5 million of that.
Does that complete your liability?
That completes, that's everything. And up to this point, we were really early investors in the Alder Creek restoration. So really at the point we came to this final step, we didn't have very much more to go because we had been investing early.
Just very quick comment that it's a real concern that some of the biggest parties in a situation that is joint and several liability are now pretty much out of that process with 11% of the total paid off. That seems like a very small portion of a very large bill that's going to come due, with the groups with the deepest pockets exiting the stage in the first round. That gives us tremendous pause. And one of the things that I think makes this process so difficult that I hope the city and EPA appreciate is that the public agencies that are supposed to be watchdogging this are also PRPs negotiating to minimize their liability. That puts the public in a uniquely vulnerable position. That the agencies we depend on to make sure that there is accountability, whether it's the city of Portland, Metro, the Port of Portland, whoever, state of Oregon, that we look to represent the public interests, from my perspective, are first and foremost protecting their pocketbooks. And I don't know how to get around that, but it's becoming an issue as these settlements come out and everything is confidential and behind the scenes. It's not double dealing, but it functions as double dealing functionally, right? You would never have people in these two positions simultaneously. And the question becomes, who's guarding the public trust? What happens when there's a $200 million gap? Who's going to pay that? And when it will all come around because it will be the public that pays it, which is the city of Portland and the state. But it's just a very, very awkward situation at this point, and it's becoming more awkward as we move to this stage.
And also the inequitable breakdown of who, how much ratepayers are charged. Large corporations are charged the same amount as one individual person who owns an old home in Portland for Superfund surcharges on their utility bill, which is not, in my mind, has never been fair. And anyone who learns about that said that's not fair, and yet the city's not been willing to restructure that or look at that, and that's very concerning.
you know, we're going into different states. There is a rate study and there is public comment processes. So if there are suggestions or
We brought them up
feedback,
and it never gets addressed.
this, you know, there is a process to address that.
Right. You had one more slide?
You know, I don't, we can probably.
It's probably contacted.
Yeah, just contact.
Rose?
Yeah, thank you. This was not the meeting to miss. Sorry, I'm not in the room with everyone. There's not a lot I'm going to say about the natural resource damage partial settlement, other than that settlement does not in any way eliminate liability to Yakima Nation. Regardless of those party settlements, there's their liability for injury to resources and to tribal lost resources for Yakima is not settled. So I'm going to move on from that. I'm sort of going back to EPA's statement about, again, thinking about land use and available industrial land and a functional river system. It's concerning when I hear EPA say that NOAA is focused on restoration and EPA is focused on risk to human health and the environment. That is true. However, EPA has legal obligations to meet ESA requirements, and their track record on that for Portland Harbor is really unfortunate. When we think about the fact that the BIOP should have been issued when the record of decision was established, meaning all that consultation should have occurred well during the remedial investigation process and should have been completed when the ROD was issued. That still has yet to be completed. And so what we end up with is a process where, you know, we're sort of doing this piecemeal destruction of habitat that jeopardize ESA listed species, and that hasn't been fully accounted for here at Portland Harbor. And so it just circles back to impacting what's happening in the river, what's happening in the upland, what's available for all sorts of land use in this area. And so I hear over and over that this is very complex. There's a multitude of partners and agencies and parties involved in Superfund, and I agree with all of that. But I think we've missed a lot of opportunities to move this process forward in a way that is really beneficial to the resources and to the people in this, to the people who depend on those resources. So I think all of that is very unfortunate. I think Yakima is working really hard to try and highlight these areas as we move forward. Unfortunately, we don't get the kind of attention that we would like to get on these issues, and we get a lot of pushback. And often it's just this continual sort of statement of complexity, but it doesn't negate responsibilities to follow the law and do what regulations, everything is set in place so that we can get really good outcomes. But when we have agencies that are not following that or maximizing or, you know, leveraging that, it makes this whole process very, very difficult.
I can just clarify that.
Yeah.
We are committed to meeting the requirements of the Invasive Species Act, and that's what I was referring to when we were talking about the compensatory mitigation. And admittedly, the biological opinion has been a long time coming. EPA issued a programmatic biological assessment years ago. We are hearing that a biological opinion is coming in a few months. We are hopeful.
Who's responsible for that?
No.
Yeah, I just want to say we've been hearing that the BIOP is coming every few months for the last 2 to 3 years. It just hasn't happened. And meanwhile, lots of decisions are being made. The process is rolling and bulldozing forward without full consideration of appropriate habitat protections in the river or upland.
How do we get confirmation on that? I mean,
How do we get what?
how do we get confirmation on that? I mean, because again,
Biological opinion.
yeah, I mean, again, this feels a little like a shell game where, you know, you have people, agencies on both sides of the issue, representing the public and also representing their own pocketbooks. You have amazing amount of confidentiality. I think sometimes far more than you actually are entitled to under the law in these processes. Despite all the public process, we get very little information back. You get a lot of input. We get very little coming back at us and almost nothing that's substantive until the decision is before us. The BIOP is critical. It gets to all the questions you've had almost throughout this entire meeting about, you know, is this going to be sufficient to protect him? How do we arrange something like the EOA to get back to where we're at in this room to make sure that we're complementary? It is a mammoth missing piece for which there is absolutely no excuse at this point. I mean, you know, by any standard, it is overdue by years. And yet we are moving forward with decisions that won't be able to be undone. I mean, you can say that we can come back and change the design. We're never coming back and changing this design. Not while anybody in this room is still alive. Once it's done for all intents and purposes. So how do we get, because I feel like we're in these rooms so often asking these questions, but we don't get answers. How do we get an answer on this one?
There's nothing that I'm aware of that's confidential about biological. So I think contacting you directly is fine. But you know, we're transmitting the information we're getting. We're calling, and we're being told it'll be issued in a few months. So that's all the information I have, and there's nothing confidential about that.
Yeah, I was understanding content of that, but just a sense of all sort of operating in an information vacuum where we come to lots of meetings and we give you our input and we hear, yeah. And I don't mean to criticize you or anybody personally, but it's kind of the sense of always inputting and never hearing back. Or getting very, very vague answers.
In the interest of time, Corky, do you have one more here? I know, Maddie, you needed to go. So
Yeah, I pushed my meeting by 15 minutes. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, I mean, you're hearing some frustration and concerns. They're all legitimate. I think we all want to move this process forward at the same time, ensure that we do it right. Let me focus a little bit though on the land supply. So that's the primary point of being here, and specifically the upland areas. Jim, this is your area here. Yeah. We've always been frustrated with getting redevelopment of the brownfields, because they're part of the Superfund. How do we move that forward faster? Because we need it from an economic perspective, we need it from an environmental perspective. I think everybody's in agreement on that. And it's upland stuff, you know, it's not as complicated as the in water. I mean, got three of you right here, you know, how do we move this forward so we can redevelop those brownfields faster? Well, don't tell me you don't know.
There's so many different aspects to that, right? So, I mean, from the Superfund perspective, like I say, that just goes up to the river bank, which could affect that land use, of course, and you know, the ability to use the waterfront. But the uplands portion, you know, to the extent there's contamination there that needs to be addressed or has been addressed, you know, that would be something to engage with the property owner and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality on, and really, you know, evaluate the specifics of that property. And in doing so, you can also evaluate the specifics of the riverbank and the shore. There are areas that, you know, are under rigorous design, and there are other areas that aren't. And that information is available. You know, as you enter into a process about a specific property, that you know, that information can be known.
And pardon me for being behind the times on this. Everybody else here is far more knowledgeable in this area than me. For the upland areas, let's just, I understand the bank is a little bit more complicated, but for Talk Bank on up, is EPA, have they handed off basically everything to DEQ?
Generally speaking, there are a few sites, you know, where we are still involved, like the Goulds, the lead battery Superfund site that was remedied many years ago. That's an example of an upland property where the EPA is the lead. But generally speaking, you know, from the riverbank up, while as Rose indicated, you know, it is part of the Superfund site. The record of decision remedy work is being done from the riverbank down under EPA oversight. What's on the uplands, riverbank back is generally under the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and they're doing two things there. They're looking at whether there's, you know, unacceptable risk to human health and the environment from the uplands, and they're also evaluating whether there's an ongoing source to the river. And so those are the two elements that have to be addressed.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If I
I've
can
always-
interject here.
Go ahead, Rose.
I'm sorry, if I can just interject really quickly on this. The Superfund site, when it was listed, includes in-water and upland areas. EPA, even Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is the lead for the upland. EPA's responsibility certainly doesn't evaporate. EPA has a responsibility to ensure that the entire Superfund site, including the uplands, has been remediated and no longer poses risks to human health and the environment. So that means that aside from just rubber stamping source control, the evaluation to ensure that there's no upland impacts to the river. I very much fear that the upland source control issues are in no way addressed, not fully. Yakama Nations, we haven't had the type of bandwidth or resources to really address a lot of the upland sites, but the things that we have looked at don't look good. But it doesn't mean that our opportunity to address that is gone. We still are addressing that. It's part of what's going to make this process long. It's part of what's going to make this process continue to be uncertain in terms of redevelopment or of that upland area. So all of these uncertainties add to the problems that we are trying to address right now. But it's very concerning because I think EPA has been like, okay, Oregon DEQ, you're responsible for that. We're doing this, but they're very much tied. There's no breaking that tie. And Oregon DEQ has said themselves they have to turn off the spigot. Unfortunately, if that spigot isn't turned off, we'll continue to have problems in river, continuing to make the upland area in question and delaying any potential redevelopment potential.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I didn't mean to indicate that EPA has no responsibility for the upland. Certainly, EPA is the support agency to Oregon DEQ in that source control aspect, and we do have a review responsibility of DEQ's decisions, and we do that. And I really apologize. I pushed my meeting and it's 15 already late. Thank you so much for having me. And you know, if there's any follow-up, I'm happy to provide any additional information.
Thank you.
Was there one more question? Oh, Jen. Yeah.
Because Courtney, you mentioned the brownfield, and you are as familiar as anyone with the toolbox that we've talked about for years about brownfield sites. So I just want to say explicitly, there are upland brownfield sites that are not part of the scope of the Superfund. And there have been many conversations with Bob and Cassie and Tom and Steve, like so many of us have been involved in for years around how to move those things forward. And I am new to this room, so I don't know if it's going to be within the scope of your discussion here. But if there's room to talk about those policies and programs that come up again and again as potential ways to move those sites forward, I would certainly think that that's a valuable piece of the conversation about how to free up some land.
And that is very much a part of this conversation. And so one thing I'm hearing is that it's probably good to maybe have you back to talk about that specifically, because obviously Superfund is something that there's none of us have a lot of control over completely, but I think it's worthwhile to have a conversation about what are the things we can do to remediate brownfields that are not Superfund site. And that is something that we had a conversation with this group a little bit about last time, and I think it's an area that we could probably dig into more. So we'll reach out to you to think about that.
All right, super fun. It has taken a long time and this discussion could take even more time, but I think what we'll do is we'll just have a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and talk about tree regulations in the heavy industrial.
Oh, no. I mean, most of the stuff is on.
My question
It's just those reports. Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, really? Oh my gosh. That's giving a lot more room for the meetings. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. So what is your?
I did interest that.
What kind of things do you do?
Yeah, I work mostly.
So excited about that. No, and it's just, I feel like that's like a thing that it might be known for a long time.
Yeah.
We should do and need to do and want to do. There was just never like a bucket of money that was for it.
Exactly.
It's not a bucket of money, just to rely. That was a perfect we had.
But at first, it's like. That was cool, but you know, it's like double. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really, it's the thing that you can't. Yeah.
The planning stuff is really exciting because it's giving us more money and staff.
Yes.
It's really wonderful. Make sure the advisory groups, review structures, like it's like, it is like, you might set up money, do, like, meet one on one people.
Yeah, really for this hot summer afternoon.
Yeah.
They're like,
Exactly. It's real.
Yeah, no,
and how, it must be, I would imagine that given the amount of community
True work, to have the money constructed, where there's opportunity to get to have this on and move forward rather than having to see whatever other dynamics. They're offer. Not up to me to name those dynamics. I sense that it's not always.
Yeah.
Oh, that truck is, we are basically government. I mean, it's-
Oh, no, yeah. So it's like,
That's Bill's connection.
No, that's a bad place.
And then housing production stuff. But based on those and Patricia.
Yeah.
Coordination on this development incentives and investments. Yes.
Yeah.
No, it was yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes. It's right there in the room with them. Yeah, so that's a big. I just left at the beach. Okay, that's worth having someone with their brain free.
Yeah.
Such a big thing on charter change. There's stuff a
Oh
lot.
my gosh.
I do really, yeah, I do really. I mean, the partners there are just such amazing people in the city that I get to
Yeah.
with all day. Yeah, and it's really multifaceted.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've done project work, like just working on one thing, which is great for, 12 months. And that's great too. I love that.
Yeah.
But I love writing also nice.
Yeah.
To mix it up a little bit.
That's my life.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah. Did y'all ever figure out a plan for the tree money thing? The mitigation fee, threshold, temporary wiring thing in Virginia?
Yeah.
That's a pretty good, tricky.
Man, I think we're.
Hold that hot potato still.
What if they are coming to the meeting stage?
Okay, you're still working with. Yeah.
Thing.
All right.
It is what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And expiring in December. The language is like tomorrow, that we're. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna transition from the Superfund area. There's a lot of information going on with and a lot of different venues for the Superfund. It does, I think, my takeaway is it creates a lot of uncertainty in the short term, at least, and in terms of getting to, it seems also with the 17 different project areas, each one is on its own path. And depending on where we're at in the harbor, that sort of influences what can go on in the upland area. So we'll need to sort of do some more research into like what that might mean for redevelopment within the time frame, the 2045 timeframe of the EOA and what we might expect. Again, we might expect something of it. And as we just ended there with Jen, the other, and Corky brought us back, the other brownfields. That seems more in our control, right? And as a city and working with DEQ and the state. But we'll do some more work, as Jen was saying, on sort of the brownfield toolbox and how we might, what would be an action plan to activate those brownfields and tap into that capacity. What we wanted to do to pivot to is talk about trees. This is another sort of policy issue, policy choice that sort of keeps coming up, and Brian will help set some context. I think it's what we have in terms of a presentation here is looking at what are the regulations that apply to the general industrial zones and the employment zones, and how they might apply to the areas that are primarily along the river and river gate, the areas that have heavy industrial zones, which have remained to be exempt from the tree regulations, and we'll get into a little bit as to why that has been, and then as a sort of future policy decision that could be resolved through the EOA process, what those implications might be. So I'm going to turn things over to Brian to dig deeper into this issue.
I screen share here.
We're gonna pause. I just want to your initial, I wasn't here in the first one, so I don't know if that was the time to bring this in, but I just want to go very simply in transparency. I've had some conversations about this process with folks outside here. And so if I'm the Taylor Swift song, we can say that. But my assumption, when I come into a conversation here, is that not just my responsibility includes engaging other community partners to ensure that I am showing up with as much perspective and context with community needs as I can into this conversation. And that, I feel, is part of the rent that I pay to be in this seat that I am in. So I just want to be very, if that was about any conversation, I am happy to, I itemize all of the conversations that I have had to date that have used the acronym EOA.
Yeah, what, thank you for Steph for bringing that back up. I think it's worth revisiting for a moment. I am not talking about those kinds of conversations. I'm not talking about conversations where you, as representatives in this conversation, are trying to better your own understanding of the issues or how the issues impact, various community and stakeholders that have an interest in this process. I am quite candidly talking about conversations in which people are going to the electeds and having conversations where they're trying to influence the outcomes of this process before we are genuinely even showing what this process is going to reveal. Or using the media. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying.
All right, Brian.
My name is Brian Landa. I'm with Urban Forestry, which is part of Parks and Recreation. And I'm going to talk to Title 11 pertains to trees and development, and talk a little bit about canopy in the city and how that pertains to this conversation, specifically about the heavy industrial lands. So first, as just a bit of background. So in 2020, BPS, BDF, and Parks worked jointly on a Title 11 amendment project, which was looking to address some concerns raised by the Planning and Sustainability Commission, the Urban Forestry Commission, environmental organizations, and community members about tree preservation requirements in development. And specifically, it was looking at some of the current exemptions that existed at the time from those tree requirements, which included the exemption for the heavy industrial lands. The result of that process was that City Council adopted some changes to Title 11 that were really mostly the recommendations by the Urban Forestry Commission and the Planning and Sustainability Commission. They removed the exemption for city-owned lots in the heavy industrial lots, zones, but they retained the IH exemption with the directive to review those exemptions again through this EOA process. So that's the reason I'm here today. And then I also just want to put this a little bit into the broader context of the work that urban forestry is doing. So we are currently updating our urban forest plan. This is the sort of guiding master plan for our management of the urban forest, which includes all the trees in the city, street trees, trees and parks, natural areas, private property. So we're currently in the community engagement phase of that work. We expect that plan to wrap up in early 2025. And then after that, we will begin a more substantive review of Title 11 and then some proposed changes to that with the idea that that project will be informed by our updated urban forest plan. But I want to note all that because while we plan to do amendments then, we are looking at this specific exemption to heavy industrial lands because the EOA is the more appropriate place to do that. So quick note just on the role of urban trees. As I mentioned, urban forestry's role is to preserve, manage, and expand the urban forests. We do this because trees are among the most valuable infrastructure in the city. They're a real driver of Portland's environmental and public health. They're essential to Portland's desirability as a place to live. And they do a lot of work. They reduce peak summer temperatures, improve air quality, which leads to better health outcomes, reduce energy costs, all sorts of wonderful things. So that's why we have trees, that's why we need trees, and that's why we're close today. A little bit about canopy. So it has established a canopy goal of 33.3%. And when we talk about canopy coverage, we're talking about the area of the city where tree foliage is covering it. So you look up, you see any part of a tree, that's part of what we consider tree canopy. We update canopy every 5 years. As of 2020, canopy stood at 29.8%. So short of our goal. And that's also down from 30.7% in 2015. And it was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people in this work. That's the first time the canopy in Portland has declined in 30 or 40 years. For a long time, Portland stood out amongst mid-sized and large cities in that we were one of the few cities where our canopy was growing, and we saw that change recently. So that's something that we are prioritizing as we're doing urban forest plan update. Our canopy is also inequitably distributed, and you can see that on this map where west of the river it's extremely high, and east of the river it's a lot bit lower. So our canopy cover on the east side is closer to a city like Los Angeles or New York City. Looking a little bit more specifically at the heavy industrial zones, so canopy coverage in industrial zones, this is not just IH, actually, that metric, that's all industrial zones, is at 8.7%, which is down from the previous, from 2015. The target set in a few city plans and policies is 10%. And we actually saw amongst commercial, residential, industrial, institutional zones, we actually found one of the biggest declines in the industrial areas. We lost 164 acres of canopy over that 5 year. Oh yeah.
Is there a way to blow that up a little bigger?
If you just, if you get rid of the stuff.
I mean, it's better. Little tiny.
Sorry.
We'll send out the slide deck.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, we lost 164 acres of canopy in the industrial zones. And for comparison, Mount Tabor Park is about 180 acres. So that's an entire Mount Tabor lost in the city over a 5 year period. So this is one of the reasons that we are prioritizing this area. We worked with a consultant about a year or two ago to try and quantify some of the benefits and the services that those trees are providing in that area. And so this is based on a inventory we did in 2019. We're looking at what those trees are doing. It's 440 tons of carbon sequestered annually, 3.6 million gallons of stormwater intercepted, 4.5 tons of pollution removal, which is the equivalent of burning about 4,000 pounds of coal. And the replacement value, which is a bit complicated, it's an industry accepted standard for assessing the value of trees, is about 33.6 million.
Why is your target only 10%?
That comes from, so it's a great question because we are actually, one of the things we're doing in the urban forest plan update is updating that. That comes from the 2004 urban forest plan. And that's one of the things that we're going to be reviewing through this. Yeah.
Typically, just to clarify, that target 10% is just for the industrial zone?
Just for the industrial.
Right, so that's
yeah.
not, that's not the
I
target.
understand.
Yeah.
I was still asking, why is it only 10%?
Yeah.
You know,
I understand. I
Yeah.
just want to make sure it was clear that that's not the,
I don't know, what's the target else?
Citywide, it's 33.3%, but in residential areas, it's 40%. So it kind of varies. We're going to be reviewing all of that because in some ways, a citywide goal, even a zone-wide goal, is maybe not as effective as more targeted. Where can we accommodate trees? Where do we need trees?
Can you talk a little bit about why we lost so much, given the fact that we have a tree code?
Yeah.
Why are we going backwards here?
Yeah. There were exemptions in the code for years. We just removed some of them back in 2022. The industrial exemptions still exist. We have a lead consultant on the urban forest plan update, and that's one of the main things we're looking at. We lost canopy in every zone. Most likely development's a major driver. Climate change is almost certainly a driver. We're seeing increased trees are dying earlier than we would expect. And so a lot of that we think is coming from heat, particularly in heavily paved areas. Trees are extremely stressed by the heat that gets absorbed by the concrete, radiated back. They don't cool down at night because that heat is just stored in the concrete. So we think it's a few things, but that's one thing we're looking at too right now. Yeah.
Have you studied, do you have data on that? Because what I'm hearing is a lot of speculation. And that's a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if somebody comes to me with a plan and then a few years later says, boy, my plan to expand actually ended up shrinking, I'd say, well, maybe we need to throw the plan out, I mean, I really have to go back and take a hard look at assumptions. Have you guys done that? And if so, where is that data?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're doing right now, actually. That's part of our urban forest plan update. So we're looking at the development data over the last 10 years to really look at where has canopy declined and then see what are some of the factors that are tied to that. Was there development happening in those areas?
But I mean, are you looking at your plan also? Because I know my personal experience, and I've told people, I said, with a new tree code, you might want to hold off on planting, and I hate saying that. It really bothers me. So, but honestly, yeah, now I've done it in my own yard too. It's like, no, maybe better not plant that, and I've planted a few dozen trees. So,
yeah, no, we're reviewing everything as we're going through this process, and I'm happy to share information to the group because there's a lot of engagement opportunities coming up. There's going to be a lot of work in that area. So yeah, that's what we're looking at.
Can I just ask a quick question of clarification? This is Timothy Novak. You said, was it about 164 acres lost, the equivalent of about Mount Tabor? Was that specifically in the IH zones, or was that?
It was not. No, that's across all industrial zones.
Okay.
Yeah, not
okay. So all
IH.
industrial zones, IG2, IG1, and
Yes.
IH.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Why don't can you move, we running out of time here.
Yeah,
So
I can.
I really want to talk about what applies in the
Yep.
in the industrial zones and
Sure thing. Yeah.
what it means to apply to the IH.
this is just another way of looking at canopy at the 25 acre scale, but for the sake of time, I'll keep moving to get onto what Title 11 tree code looks like in development. So a few key features of the tree code development. It provides clear and objective standards for tree preservation and removal. There is a baseline of allowable removal without any mitigation required. And there is always a fee in lieu of preservation or planting option. So there's really no point in development where it will be required to retain a tree. There's always an option to remove the tree, but there are mitigation fees attached to that.
Right. If you replant on site something that will grow to have a comparable canopy, then you still have to pay the mitigation fee, or is it one or the other?
You still pay the mitigation for the removal of the tree. Replanting takes 20, 30 years to really replace the value that was lost. So yeah, the code treats it in two different steps, basically.
You have to do both.
You have to do both. Yeah, and that's what I'll get into that in the next few slides. So first, I'm going to talk about preservation. So first, where preservation requirements do not apply. So currently, private trees on portable sites located within IH zone. That is the lone zoning exemption from Title 11 right now. There's also exemption for sites with more than 85% current or proposed building coverage. So that's intended to try to accommodate the sort of intended use for the site. And then things like dead, dying, dangerous, or nuisance species trees are exempt from mitigation. Those can be removed without any mitigation fee requirement or replanting requirement. And then trees under 12 inches DBH. So DBH is how we measure the size of trees. It's the diameter of the tree at 4.5 feet off of the ground. So tree about that far around. Trees under that size are not regulated by Title 11 when they're on private property.
Those last two are the same citywide. Those are.
Yes. Yeah. And trees under 12 inches, that's around 50 to 60% of the trees in the city. So if I talk about sort of like baseline of removal allowed without any mitigation, we're really starting there. So when we talk about preserving trees on site, we're talking about the largest trees, and we're talking about healthy non-nuisance trees. And even then, there are allowances for removal. So for the trees that are between 12 inches and 20 inches, 1/3 of those need to be preserved in development. 2/3 can be removed. If those 1/3 are removed, a fee is assessed. And then beyond that, we're getting to the top 10% size trees 20 inches DBH or greater. All of those trees need to be preserved, or a fee in lieu is paid. And then getting into the tree planting requirements. So as I mentioned, sort of like a two-step process. First, the preservation requirement, then there's tree planting. Tree planting requirements are triggered whenever there's a new development, or if significant exterior alterations are made. So looking at exemptions from that requirement, similar to before, IH continues to be exempt from that. There's also exemptions based on the primary use of the site, so rail yards, agricultural uses, and a few others are listed in code. So there are some existing exemptions based on that as well. So when we look at what tree planting requirements are, this is where we get back to that 10% canopy goal. So the requirement is that you will plant to allow for 10% canopy coverage over the site. And I think one thing that kind of trips people up in this is they think that means that you have to set aside 10% of your site for tree planting, and that's actually not how the canopy coverage works. It's based on a calculation of the expected growth of the tree. So typically, that 10% can be met by planting on about 1 to 2% of the site. So it doesn't really take up that much space. And then the last thing I'll say on that is the costs to meet that requirement are subject to the non-conforming upgrades limitation as well. So it's one of many non-conforming upgrade considerations. It's not necessarily an added cost on top of that.
So Brian, what you're saying there is that planting helps you meet your non-conforming requirements if you're making upgrades to site or
Yes.
remodeling the building or.
Yeah, Exactly, it's included in all of that. And so you can meet that 10% through a combination of preserving existing trees, planting new ones, or paying a fee in lieu. So the different ways to actually meet.
Tell me if I'm wrong here, though, that is now no longer in place for housing, right? Because it was non-conforming uses no longer have to do that under the new.
Right, this is, we're talking about industrial.
I know, I just want to make sure that we capture that because we're talking about why we're losing trees.
Yeah.
We just exempted for till 2029,
And
non-conforming housing.
that's true, just also to note, non-conforming requirements span a lot of different things, right? Not just trees.
Just saying that we are actually going backwards on the regulatory structure as well. So to speak, on the places where we do have it in place, this is a place where we don't have it in place.
I have just 2 more quick slides. I'll turn it over to Sam for something he's going to talk through. We worked with a consultant to look at what would be the benefits of applying these tree planting requirements to these heavy industrial zones. So the way that we did that, we looked at the buildable lands inventory and we calculated how many trees would be planted if every site in the BLI was developed over the 20-year period. And we found that it would result in the planting of almost 7,000 trees with a lot of associated benefits and services there. And that the value of those trees over time would be about $52.6 million. So just looking at, what are if we were to remove this exemption, what would we see happening in these zones? And then very lastly, we also looked at, what tree canopy are we talking about when we look at this? Because when we look at the BLI, it's about 4,008 acres across all the lots. And there's about 50 acres of canopy there. And then with the existing E zones and greenway zones, we're already regulating about 27 acres of that canopy. So when we talk about what is actually not regulated by Title 11, that would be if we were to remove the exemption, it's about 22.5 acres of canopy. And it's actually spread across just a few number of sites, but I think it's a little bit what Stan's going to talk about also. But so yeah, I just want to kind of put it in context of where's the canopy and how is it spread out.
That's 400, not 4,000.
Did I say 4,000? Sorry.
Depends on, so it's, right. The all IH lots is everything, including existing development, and which obviously has an impact on ability for businesses to expand. We have a couple examples of that. So, we're looking at sort of both situations.
Are you able to look at, since you're looking at carbon sequestration estimates, also like air quality, how greater canopy could impact air quality?
Yeah, so we one of the benefits we were able to calculate is the amount of air pollution that's removed. So with those 7,000 trees, annually about 3.5 tons of air pollution would be removed. Sorry, it's small.
Right.
Yeah. Bob, I have a question.
Bob.
Ryan, so what year did we do Title 11?
It was implemented 2015.
Yeah, but it was done
It was done in 2011.
Yeah, 2011.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think the last person still active worked on that plan.
Yeah.
And I just want to really highlight, but whether they're not allowing me to work on the new plan because Parks doesn't believe in putting people with gray hairs to participate, but that's between me and Brian. Thank you to PPS for still including both people. I'm over it, Brian. Brian, I had a great conversation. But the reason, one of the last things that was taken out of that plan went through a very long council process. It was a huge process. It was a couple of years of committee meetings and then like almost a year of council meetings. One of those things, and then it got delayed and being implemented for years and years. But one of the last things that was removed was industrial lands. And why was it removed? It was removed because we didn't have an up-to-date EOA. There was fear the river industry would go down to Salem, as they had previously done on other issues, go to Luba and get it, the whole plan thrown out. And so literally, I think it was the last meeting or the second to last meeting, or after a year, we got the news, it's coming out. But don't worry, and this was said in the council, you go back and listen to the tapes. Don't worry, we will bring this back within a couple of years. We will do the EOA, we will update it, we promise you that, and the first thing on the docket will be trees. Well, we did update the DOA finally in 2015, and we said, okay, let's do the trees. Yeah, we got other priorities, but we'll get to that, don't worry. Then we did the update on Title 11, and we said, okay, well, we have an updated EOA. And they said, no, the updated EOA, it's out of date again. Gosh darn. Here we are again. We got to do another updated one. And then so this one's been postponed for years. And so I say all that because I'm hearing rumor that some groups in this room are trying to get this postponed again. Let's kick it to the next council. And if that is true, what we're not looking at a postponement of several months, we're probably looking at another postponement of several years, because I don't believe the next council is going to come back and try and do the EOA first thing out of the gate with 11, 12 new commissioners, whatever it is. And so as we've been delaying and delaying and delaying, we've been losing trees in the most tree depleted areas of the city. So it speaks to the urgency, because we can't even have a real conversation about this. And I'm fearful that your new committee is going to get hand-tied as well, that as soon as they start having this conversation, you're going to start to have the EOA conversation, and it's going to go sideways and upside down and backwards again. Well, I think the thing here to understand is we have been in this situation now for 13 years. And that's absurd. It speaks to why we've got to get this done. And my perspective is, even if it's not perfect, we need to get it done, and then we need to make sure that we move forward very quickly on everything that's been suspended, whether it's floodplains, trees, or environmental zones, because there's now a backlog of plans that cost millions of dollars, but the huge public process, and were not applied to the industrial area because of a lack of EOA. And generations are now going by. It's not a matter of a year or two. We're talking about 13, and we could be talking about 20 before we get through all the backlog of stuff that was skipped.
Briefly on that, I was around them too. The tree code was applied in about 2/3 of the industrial zones. It wasn't applied in IH. As we talked about.
Well, and several others too. The others were added in.
IH and IG1, small lot acres, very little. It was applied in about 2/3 of the industrial areas where most of the development has occurred.
What was it?
In 2011.
The rivers, the heavy industrials, it's the most important ecological areas of the city in terms of canopy.
Yeah, so I'm just going to development examples is one term here, but we could talk about it in terms of kind of development scenarios too. We're going to start at some IG2 zoning here. This is one area that does actually have an existing canopy in place. It's over 5 acres, over 6 acres almost. This total site is 22 acres. Wanted to highlight this because it is an example of an industrial site that borders a residential area that has canopy, that's providing improved air quality, noise buffering, etc. But it does have that available acreage available for expansion for additional industrial uses. We have a development scenario where you could conceivably have, 100,000, 200,000 square foot building expand into that area with the existing canopy. And actually, the development scenario would be that the developer, the property owner, would pay for that mitigation for removing any tree that is above that 20%, 20 inches, or if they get into that sort of 12 to 20 range. But there would not necessarily be a need to replant if 10%, if the 10% coverage was met, which is that minimum. So there's some flexibility there. This is one example. I'm going to talk about Meadows West, which is actually happening right now. Another IG2 site. This is a out-and-out example because it's under construction. It's alongside I-5. There's some perimeter trees along the outside of the site, as well as a few on the interior, but it's sort of mostly gravel. Next slide. It is 16 acres and IG2 zoning. Again, the proposed building is almost 300,000 square feet. It's pre-leased. Said there's sort of a sparse amount of vegetation that exists currently, so it's more about sort of tree planting rather than removal. But if we go to the next slide, and then there's that sort of tree grove at the top that's actually owned by ODOT and not part of this development. Just wanted to highlight that because it looks like it from this angle. But anyway, the tree plan under this development, this permit called for 26 trees to be preserved, 7 removed, but only 6 that are actually kind of hitting that 20-inch and above mark that requires a mitigation fee to be paid. That mitigation fee the developer paid was about $66,000. Then that very last bullet says under the kind of planting code, that canopy code, the tree density that was required was 670,000 square feet. The developer's actually proposing almost 150,000 square feet of tree of sort of tree density. The reason for that being that beyond the tree code, there are Title 33 elements that relate to landscaping, and they basically met that landscaping through tree planting. And so it's that 15%, 100,000 or more square feet of landscaping was required in addition to some of the planning for canopy cover. So they've met that through all of that tree planting. So moving on, wanted to break down what that means in terms of like potential development costs. So here we have a 16 acre site using very rough numbers that Walkie may have issues with, but 7 to 10 million of land cost. This site was transacted several years ago, so this is just a high level estimate in today's dollars. Development cost, we're looking at somewhere in the realm of 30 to 35 million, bringing our site development cost to maybe 40 million in terms of total hard costs. With that mitigation fee and the tree planting, we're looking at maybe just over 100,000, $114,000 for that tree compliance, which equates to less than 0.5% of the total development cost, which is excluding land on the sort of like the lower end. So not a huge amount, and most of that is due to the landscaping requirement as well. So I'm going to move ahead and kind of get into IH, our heavy industrial zones that where obviously which is exempt under the current tree code, but I'm highlighting another potential kind of development scenarios. Here we've got a site that's 73 acres across these 3 tax lots. It's a rail yard. There's an existing grove in the bottom corner there that is largely covered under our E-zone. Under an E-zone right now, and the sort of the most of the canopy in that E-zone area is about 7 acres, so it's almost like 10% already. But if you were to remove any of that canopy, then obviously there would be mitigation for removal to be paid, not necessarily any replanting required, but under the exemption under the tree code, currently we exempt rail yards, so it could qualify for that exemption anyway.
Okay, since you brought up E-zone, and we started some of this conversation in terms of what the coverage should look like. I'm just curious, has there been an analysis of what tree canopy preservation were in Title 11, like how these two fit?
Can we go back to slide that had the tree canopy acreage? I think that we glossed over that. Yeah. I think that we glossed over this really fast. I think we need to talk about this.
Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know, Brian, if this is you or if this is more us interpreting what this data means. Okay.
Yeah, it was to try and get exactly that question. Looking at both all the lots in the heavy industrial zones and also just the one specifically in the buildable lands inventory. We exempted city-owned lots because those are not exempt from Title 11. Those aren't subject to Title 11 right now. But I was looking at that. What is the total canopy? Which in all the IH lots, it's 292 acres of canopy. Of those, about half is within an E zone or a greenway zone. So Title 33 is regulating and protecting trees for about half the canopy in the heavy industrial zones right now. The other 146 acres or so within all IH lots are exempt. They're not in E zone, they're not in a greenway zone, and Title 11 does not protect them.
Yeah. How good of a job do you feel that the greenway zone is doing protecting trees? Because from my experience, and I was alluded to earlier, you can cut down trees in the greenway zone and with a river use. And I think companies have been remiss in terms of meeting their mitigation requirements. I did a effort where I got all the different mitigation requirements from the city of the real bear to get that, because you need to go through every individual site. And then went up and down the river, and all those trees that were supposed to be planted as part of mitigation, almost none of them were there. They didn't exist. And yet the city keeps issuing more development permits, and you're supposed to be in compliance with your past permits before. So the city hasn't been enforcing backwards either. And now we're into an era, I think, as was alluded to earlier by someone online, where we have businesses saying, well, we shouldn't have to mitigate anyways because it's all going to get torn out because of Superfund. So I would argue that the river industrial zone setbacks and those kinds of things have been relatively ineffective in protecting trees as well. Am I wrong there?
I would bring the BPS on that.
Kind of assuming that Timothy is about to step in on this. Is that for you,
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's true that really within the greenway overlays, the only trees that are protected are those within the greenway setback. And so the overwhelming majority of area within the greenway overlays does not have any protections at all. And it's really just subject to, say, parking lot landscaping or other such landscaping requirements in the IH. So that number might be a little bit deceiving in that way and not quite capturing the ability to remove trees or canopies subject to the exemptions.
But I will note that, so in recognition of that fact, so if IH had tree code requirements, it would apply to the rest of the lot. And so in these numbers, we've actually accounted for that because we are trying to what we've talked about in terms of getting a better constraint estimate that really is related to the greenway overlay zone, the current greenway overlay zone, and to compare the different, with what we talked about with river environmental and river overlay zones. If we were to also what greenway requirements are in that setback. And for the river eye, it's a little bit different because it's really 75 feet from the from the top of the bank, because in the river eye, you don't have to really get to go through greenway review or anything if you are at least 75 feet from the top of the bank, so you're 50 feet from the setback. And so for the river eye, we've actually looked at it like that. 75 feet is kind of constrained, but these numbers account for that, because the current greenway and the river industrial specifically is really focused on that setback area, not the remainder of the site.
Yeah, and we talk more offline, but my point was not the rest. My point was actually greenway itself, where if you have a river dependent use, you can take out the trees and you have to mitigate for it, and the mitigation is not getting done and the enforcement's not following. So even within that protected area that you're describing, I would say that they're not protected. I think when we get to tree code, we're gonna have to really think about how do you actually make sure that either they're protected or they're mitigated, and that mitigation, if it is not done, prevents people from further permitting, which is what's supposed to happen. There's a disconnect there that's very apparent, where people have not followed through their mitigation requirements and still continue to get permitted for additional development, which should not happen.
Which department is in charge at the city? Which bureau of implementing mitigation or enforcement?
Enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about, I don't know if necessarily this is too pertinent to what we're saying, but essentially I get what you're saying, Bob. I mean, we would still be using the same approach. It's the greenway would be a greenway violation if the mitigation does not maintain as it's supposed to. We utilize a complaint-based system, and if there are, and there is a backlog with complaints, but we can talk about, separate conversation about all of that, but we can assume that regardless, we're not going to assume that Title 11 would address that issue related to the setback. That would be, especially like with the new structure, would be the river environmental, making sure, and then that would all be in the river environmental. And very similar in terms of the process that we would use to the greenway. And that's more of a compliance, ensuring compliance over time and that sort of thing. Title 11 would just be focused on the areas in the greenway. If we did the river overlay zone, it would basically, all of it would be addressed in the river process, but river overlay process. Title 11
agreement. This is for Brian and his task force. Because I think that's where you're losing a lot of trees as well.
So I just got one more example, and if anybody's focused on the boundary of that greenway, that kind of revised greenway area, then that's on the map around here, which also shows the canopy coverage, the current E zones, and BLI lots as well. So we got them all around here. But yeah, here we go. So this one's kind of interesting. Well, it is interesting. We're specifically focused on the sort of these 2-3 acre vacant lots down here just south of Terminal 4, owned by the port. And it's another example that would require planting to meet that 10% canopy coverage, which would be 10% of that 6 acre total, so 0.6 acres of canopy coverage. The space required to plant that would be just under 4,000 square feet of that site. So it's a small percentage of the site, 1.5%. But alternatively, this is a vacant site that if in the future at some point the T4, for example, develops, then it can be used as that kind of mitigation bank or tree planting bank for that site. It's worth noting that there's the greenway along the front there. It's approximately 4 acres, and so that's that would be incorporated into that as well. So yeah, it would be also in conjunction with the Title 33 requirements. That's another thing of note.
And I think the purpose of this example was to show just how, if you have a large site and you have the greenway area, that can meet part of the tree planting, tree canopy requirements. If there's other vacant land elsewhere on the site, that can go towards it, and then ultimately, you can pay the fee in lieu.
I think another interesting thing to point out is just how you're ultimately satisfying a number of different regulations, right? Through when you're satisfying this requirement. I think that's also kind of noteworthy, is that you have, whether it's landscape requirements of the Title 33 or if it's any kind of habitat mitigation requirements, it ends up satisfying multiple requirements. I think that's helpful. And I think it's also noteworthy what you were describing about the 10% canopy doesn't mean 10% of the land, right? Like that's the distinction as well.
Yeah, Corky.
I'm wondering if we're kind of missing some perspective here. Is it possible to pull up either a greenway picture of the entire city or a tree canopy picture of the entire city, or just a satellite view of it?
Is that these maps up on the wall?
No, I'm talking, well,
Yeah.
no, I'm talking about the entire city, but.
That's most of the city.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think they're there too.
All right. So it's, the greens are a little strange there, but if you look at that, look at the residential area. I think everybody knows where residential areas are in the city, and the tree canopy there. And then look at the tree canopy up in the industrial areas. And none of these pictures actually do this correctly. The industrial area has overall, not the industrial zones, parcel by parcel, but the whole area has about a third of tree canopy, of open space. It has about a third open space in it. Pretty darn good. It's a whole lot better than the residential area. So we keep looking at parcel by parcel, and that's important. I don't mean to be taken away from that, but I fear that maybe we've lost track of something here. When a lot of this development happened in the industrial areas, they intentionally set aside open space to compensate for the parking lots that we have, the pavement that they need to put down. And what I'm seeing now is, oh, well, you know, you did a little while ago with the ODOT parcel. Oh, there's the ODOT parcel. Ignore that. Well, hang on a second. That was part of the overall plan. And I don't hear anybody addressing that. If you look at the whole Columbia corridor, you say, whoa, lots of open space. This is cool. But we seem to be only looking at parcel by parcel and saying it's not very good. It'd be a little bit like me looking at my home lot and saying, well, if I only look at the driveway, I say there's not enough tree canopy. Well, that's because it's my driveway. But if you look at my whole lot, it's not so bad. Yeah. So I worry that we're kind of, shall I say, not seeing the forest for the trees. No, I won't go there. That worries me that we're not doing that. And then related to that is, and maybe this is the right spot, you know, Brian's presentation talked about the value of the trees. Absolutely, completely. But we need to also, of course, in this forum, address the value of that industrial area and what's the balance there. So I'm just worried that we're not looking at the whole picture here.
I think that's a great comment. And that is why we're bringing all these different topics to this space to really dive deeply into each of them and to like really appreciate the complexity of each of them. And certainly when you overlay all of the considerations, right? So I think you're right. And Brian, like I heard you say at some point earlier in your presentation about the work that's happening in the context of the urban forest plan is to look not just about at percentages, but to really look at, you know, where there's opportunity and where there's need. And to think about it a little bit more holistically. I do appreciate and think that there's something to the notion that maybe it's not necessarily valuable to have it on a site-by-site basis because, you know, and I'm not an arborist, I don't really understand the science of trees, but I do think that, you know, there's value when trees are not just a one-off here or one-off there, but like located in groups and can materially have an impact on the physical environment. And so I think it would be interesting to try to investigate that further and maybe bring some other approaches to this group.
To me, that's one, or can I have different memory to that? We certainly talked during that period, how did it, rather than I, because he's there before me, talked about the need to protect the waterways, and a lot of that involved trees. So, and one of the frustrations with things like Columbia Corridor was the lack of adequate protection for waterways. So there is a different perspective there, and I don't think you get that value from simply having natural areas as well. I agree with you. There are certainly natural areas there. The second thing is, I don't disagree with what you're saying either, but this goes back to kind of the age-old argument that I've raised a few times in this process, which is, I think there are better ways to do it. Industry has been the one, when BPS came out with purple green, which I've referenced, which was basically more of a, how do we get to where we want to be and where it makes the most sense? Industry rejected that. They said, we want to go to a zoning approach. We're in a zoning approach here. If we're going to use a zoning approach, then we have to kind of use this kind of an approach. So I feel like it's a little bit of a bait and switch where it's like, whichever approach we're using, we want the other one. At this point in my life, having gone through this 20 million times, I could care less which one we use, but I want to make sure we get to the values at the end of it. The problem is we don't get to there. And there's benefits and challenges to each when you start to go toward what are really the opportunity areas that disproportionately affects some people more than others. You know, this property is really valuable from an ecological standpoint. This one isn't. We're letting them off the hook. And that goes back to kind of more of an, how do we do 100,000 foot level? I just don't want to get caught up in that kind of mess at the very end of this process too. We need to pick a path and then do our best on it, not kind of pivot back and forth.
Other thoughts on trees? If not, we have 15 minutes. We wanted to talk a little bit about next steps. Because this is our 6th meeting. We initially laid out a 6-meeting process, but we've had a lot of good, deep discussions. I think we feel like there's a need for 1 or 2 more meetings. There's been a lot of good feedback and requests for more information, like, what are the wages associated with warehouse jobs, and some of the, how would the new floodplain or greenway regulations apply? And so we've been working on some of that to bring back to you all that will help inform this process. So I guess I wanted to throw it out to the group to see if you're willing to invest time in 2 more meetings in March and April. We would bring back more information. We're certainly, open to sort of feedback from you on particular issues. We can send out maybe next week a preliminary list of what we've been working on to bring back. And then we would come back in April with trying to, how do we pull this all together and work towards what I would call a preliminary draft of an EOA that begins some sort of combination of policy choices that looks at the how they balance out and work together. So, I mean, what do folks think? Are you willing to stick with us for a couple more meetings?
It feels like we're not at the end. Like, I mean, I don't want to add more meetings to my calendar, and I certainly don't want to sound like I'm, as some people have expressed some concern that it's delay tactics, no. But it feels like we're not at all complete, and so that's my 2 cents worth. Also, as John left, he apologized for having to leave early, but he asked me to convey he very strongly feels that we need more.
Right, and can I also just say that, we've been working really hard throughout this process to keep pace with the conversation and to provide more information and to strategize about what the best things are to bring to the group for conversation. And I would just say that not only, I kind of agree with you more, Corky, that we're not done with our conversations. We also want to be respectful of your time. We're saying 2 more meetings, and I think that's definitely, those 2 meetings will be important. And I also think that it may be that, we have the meetings, there's a bit of a pause so that we can do more work. And then we might sort of want to reconvene you for a meeting or 2 at some later time in the process. So I just want to keep it out there and a little bit open.
Yeah, I can see it being very productive.
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to maybe, reconvene the group a little bit just to sound out certain things as we're sort of trying to define what the recommendations might be like. So, but yeah, curious to hear if others are willing to commit a little bit more time to this process.
Benton's come on camera. Did you have something to add, Benton?
Yeah, I 100% agree that we obviously need to have a conversation now about what the recommendations might be, right? And so, yeah, I think that what I would be interested in seeing, Tom, I think you just brought it up, is if we're going to have a couple more meetings, is probably the second one. Is like, let's have a sort of brass tacks conversation about what are the trade-offs we're going to make now that we have all these information inputs. What are we talking about? What are those trade-offs? And then what I assume are kind of a couple different documents look like, right? One is a direct economic document, one is a potential recommendation for agreement across the different priorities. So I just wanted, if we're going to do that, I think there was a lot in today's meeting that was sort of like some clear and definitely understandable frustration about the history of several processes related to this. So I want to make sure that if we do this again, we're having a clear discussion about what we can and cannot do in those future meetings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Patty. Definitely would agree with that.
Any other thoughts? Go ahead, Scott.
Agreed.
Okay. All right, well, as Patricia said, we'll regroup. If you all have thoughts about sort of outstanding questions, or sort of additional information that would be helpful, as Benton just said, to sort of really look at the trade-offs in these policy choices, please send them my way. And we'll work out with Deb sort of see how meetings agendas might fall out and when. And then we'll get to work on bringing that information back. Yeah, Cassie?
I echo, like, I think, yeah, the more substantive, like, drafts you can share with us ahead of time, ahead of a meeting. So we can have, rather than it be more informational like it has been, but just like get to the substantive breakdown of what the content is that you're drafting is gonna be, I think, good use of time for us if we continue.
Yeah, good point. All right. Oh,
I'll say very briefly, a few things that I've heard from folks that with include, like, have we brought into this conversation the concept of vertical industrial, again, about wages, so I really appreciate that. And also what they have recently put into place in Eugene, which is a public health overlay zone. Where does that fit within this concept?
Good, thank you. All right, thank you, everybody, for your time today. You know where to find us if you have additional thoughts. And we'll see you later.
Thank you.
Timothy. Yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Peace.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Most of my ideas.